If you have come here, I presume that you think of me as a person who invokes some interest. I have an appeal to make to all of you. If you like this talk, please consider making a small contribution to any charity or a cause of your choice. You need not inform me that you have made the contribution, but I shall be extremely delighted if you do so. Now, coming on to the subject, materialism in common parlance has a negative connotation. A materialist goal is generally seen as one achieved without any moral scruples and looked down upon. On the other hand, idealism is perceived as positive. In popular usage, an idealist is someone who believes in high ideals and strives to make them real, even though they may be impossible. It is often contrasted with the words pragmatist or realist. That is someone whose goals are less ambitious but probably more achievable. In philosophy, however, these two terms, idealism and materialism, are understood in a different way. There are many definitions available of materialism, but I like the one I found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is what it says: something mental, the mind, spirit, or the will, something mental is the ultimate foundation of all reality, or even exhaustive of reality. Is it clear? There's something which is connected with your brain, with your mental, is the ultimate foundation of all reality, or even exhaustive of reality. Although the existence of something independent of the mind is considered, everything that we can know about the mind independent reality is held to be so permeated by creative, formative, constructive activities of the mind of some kind or the other, that all claims to knowledge must be considered in some sense to be a form of self-knowledge. I will translate it into English. This simply says mind independent reality is also perceived by mind. This is what idealism is all about. In Indian philosophical systems, all six systems of Hindu philosophy and Buddhist and Jainist philosophies are supposed to belong to the idealist school. Sankhya philosophy sticks out like a sore thumb, but let it not bother us now. Jainas too, speak of karmic idealism. We will discuss these things later in some detail when I touch upon these when I come to these systems of philosophy. Materialism, by way of sharp contrast, means this: materialism in philosophy is the view that all facts, including facts about the human and the course of human history, are causally dependent upon physical processes or even to them. The causally is the word which is important. Causally means what which is the cause. If what is my cause? My cause is my parents, coupling. I was born because my parents united. So my cause is I am causally dependent on my parent. That's a physical reality. This is what materialism says. The ancient Indian materialists took a view that it was plain nonsense to talk of a soul apart from the body, and that the concept of liberation was at best deception. They ridiculed karma theory. One minute. What is important is that they singled out Brahmins and ascetics for criticism. In a famous passage from Valmiki Ramayana, we have Jabali saying this to Rama. And the food eaten by one, can it nourish other men? Food given to Brahmins, can it serve our departed fathers then? Crafty priests have forged these maxims and with selfish objectives say, make your gifts and do your penance, leave the worldly wealth and pray. This is what Jabali says to Rama. Before discussing materialism in detail, I will use this opportunity to bring in the concept of pramanas. The pramanas are a very important concept in the Indian philosophical systems. What is a pramana? Pramana is a means by which one obtains accurate and valid knowledge about the world. It can be loosely translated into a measure or proof. For all practical purposes, pramana means proof. 6 types of pramanas are spoken of. They are pratyaksha pramana, anumana pramana, upamana pramana, arthapatti pramana, anupalabdhi pramana, sabda pramana. Perception, pratyaksha is perception. You accept what you see with your own eyes, or smell with your own nose, or hear with your ears. For instance, if you are born, you are bound to die. This is a pratyaksha pramana. We all see human beings being born and dying. If you cut someone alive, you will shed blood which will be of the color of red. Of course, there are several nuances, but they need not detain us here. This is a simple definition of pramana. Anumana means inference. It is described as reaching a new conclusion and truth from one or more observations and previous truths by applying reason. I will explain it simply. What is anumana? Inference. Observing smoke and inferring fire is an example of anumana. Or when there are dark clouds in the sky, you infer that there will be rainfall. The third pramana is upamana. Upamana means comparison or by analogy. I will give an example. Let's say Krishna inquires of a forester about a buffalo, having heard the word buffalo used among his schoolmates, but not knowing what it means. That is, not knowing what a buffalo is. Questioned by Krishna, the forester replies that the buffalo is like a cow, mentioning certain specific similarities as also some dissimilarities. Now Krishna now knows in general what the word means. Later, encountering a buffalo, Krishna says, this which is similar to cow is the meaning of the word buffalo. So this is upamana. You give an analogy to make things intelligible to a person. Arthapatti means presumption. I will give an example of Arthapatti, a simple example. Devadatta looks healthy and has a well-rounded tummy. Devadatta doesn't eat during the day. The perception is that he eats at night. The next is Anupalabdhi. Anupalabdhi means non-cognition. Again, I will explain it by giving an example. If an elephant were in the room, in this room, I would perceive it. I don't perceive an elephant in the room. Hence, there is no elephant in the room. This is Anupalabdhi Pramana. Sabda means relying on the words of the past and present experts, seers, scholars, great men, especially the rishis of the Vedas. Hiriyana explains the Sabda Pramana as a concept which means reliable, expert testimony. Why are we having these 6 systems of pramanas, these measures, this proof? For the simple reason that if you don't accept any of these pramanas, any discussion with you will be impossible. You need a system of discussion. You should accept at least one of these pramanas. Only then there will be room for discussion with you. If you don't accept any of them, then discussions will go here. It will not be proper. There is no arena in which the discussion can take place. The Lokayata and the Charvaka, that is the materialist school of philosophy, accepts only the Pratyaksha Pramana. That is what you see. That is only Pramana they accept. The Buddhist school accept both Pratyaksha and Anumana, and maybe the Sabda Pramana, especially the words of Buddha. Sankhya, Yoga, Dvaita school accept Pratyaksha, Anumana and Sabda Pramana. The Nyaya school accept Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana and Sabda Pramana. The Prabhakara Mimamsa school accept every Pramana except Anupalabdhi. But the Advaita and the Bhatta Mimamsa school accept the 6 systems, all 6 systems of Pramanas. So this you should keep in mind. In future, we will be talking about this Pramanas. What are these Pramanas? We will be talking about this. We all know that the Vedic scholars insisted so emphatically on the truth of the Vedas and on their indispensability if we were to travel the path to wisdom and liberation. This naturally invited contradiction and criticism. They all came, they above all came from Buddhists and the Jainas, but the most vehement criticism came from the materialists. The materialist school was a vigorous school of thought that used the same, the system, the Sudra commentary form of writing that has become so familiar to us from the Hindu systems of school, from various systems of the schools of philosophy in India. But they use this Sutra commentary form to reject everything held dear to the philosophers of the schools. The school was, of course, equally inimical to the beliefs of Buddhists and Jainas. They were, in fact, the true rebels of classical Indian thought, champions of philosophy and way of life grounded firmly within this world. This was called Charvaka philosophy or Baraspatya philosophy or Lokayata philosophy. Lokeshu Ayata Lokayata. It was called Lokayata because it was prevalent among the people. Lokeshu Ayata Lokayata. Now, so far is it clear? This school, this Lokayata school, took its cue from early materialist ideas already circulating around the time of Buddha. The key text of the tradition is ascribed to a man named Brihaspati and is called, of course, the Charvaka Sutra. It is unfortunately lost but can be reconstructed to some extent thanks to quotations found in bitter and angry rivals. Evidence of later Sarvaka thinkers and of verses encapsulating the Sarvaka teaching are also transmitted only indirectly. Indeed, of all the traditions we have so far, Sarvaka is by far the least well preserved in surviving tests, precisely because of its irrelevance. Yet, it was still known in India in the 16th century. See, it was explained to the Mughal Emperor Akbar. It was told to Akbar that Sarvakas regard paradise as a state in which man lives as he chooses, free from the control of another, and hell, the state in which he lives subject to another's rule. They admit only of such disciplines as tend to the promotion of external order, that is, a knowledge of just administration and benevolent government. This was what Akbar was told as the core of Sarvaka philosophy. But Sarvakas were detested right from the beginning. D.P. Chattopadhyaya comes out with this episode in Mahabharata. After the great Mahabharata war, when Pandavas are returning in triumph, thousands of Brahmins gathered at the city gate to bestow blessings on Yudhishthira. Among them was one Sarvaka. He said to the king, "This assembly of Brahmins are cursing you because you have killed your brothers and other close relatives. What have you gained by destroying your own people and murdering your elders?" This outburst of Sarvaka stunned the assembled Brahmins, who of course were there only to bless Yudhishthira. Okay. Yudhishthira felt grievously insulted and in fact wanted to die. But then the Brahmins collected themselves and told him that Charvaka was only a demon in disguise. They then burnt him to ashes. This passage in Mahabharata denotes the contempt the Brahmins had for the Sarvaka philosophy, and if it was the same Sarvaka who propagated Lokayata philosophy. The Sarvakas were supposed to have disputed the truths of both Vedic ritual practices and the Shramana way of living, the Jain and Buddhist way of living, which promised that favorable deeds will be rewarded with good fruits either in this life or in another world or during a further incarnation in this world. Brahaspati dismisses this, stating bluntly in two consecutive sutras that religious acts are not to be performed. This is one sutra, and that the second sutra is religion's instructions are not to be relied upon. There are other verses which are even more forthright. There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world, nor do the actions of four castes, orders, and so on produce any real effect. Brahaspati says the fire ritual, the Vedas, the ascetics 3 staves, that is the Tridandi sannyasis, the 3 staves, smearing oneself with ashes, all these are the livelihood of those destitute of knowledge and manliness. This is what he says. He ridicules both the Vedic believer and Buddhist or Jaina ascetics. Other Sarvaka verses likewise take aim at both the targets. This marks the Brahmins. If being in heaven are gratified by my offering here, then why not give the food down below to those who are standing on the rooftop? Why do you want to go right up to the heaven? It will be easy if you give the food to a person who is standing on the rooftop. This is what the Sarvaka, asked. The Shramanas, they are marked like this. The naked one, that is the Jain, and the ascetic dimwit, given to practicing physical hardship. Who has taught you this way of leading life? You are a fool. That's what it says. But Brahaspati was not the first to make such unpopular statements. Now, Ajita Kesa Kampala, a rough contemporary of the Buddha, said that there is no consequence to almsgiving, sacrifice, or oblation. A good or bad action produces no result. Ajita Kesa Kampala also held that a human being has no self or soul that can survive bodily death. He denied the reality of both this world and the other world. This makes him sound like a radical skeptic or a nihilist, but in fact he probably said only that we are guaranteed no future fruits from our actions in either this or the next world. In place of the unfounded promises of the Vedas, the sayings of Buddha or Mahavira, the advice of Ajita and the later Sarvaka is to look solely to the evident and immediate consequences of what we do. This we should keep in mind. The idea that the mind or self, if the self exists at all, can survive on its own without the body, that is, the mind is independent of the body, came under attack very early in Indian philosophical history. Ajita Kesa Kampala, of course, he rejected Vedic rituals and his fruits, as I said, either this or the next life. Okay. He says very, very clearly, this human being is composed of 4 great elements. And when one dies, the earth part reverts to the earth, the water part to water, the fire part to fire, the air part to air. The faculties pass away into space. They accompany the dead man with 4 bearers and the bier as 5th. Their footsteps are heard as far as the cremation ground. There the bones whiten, the sacrifice ends in ashes. It is the idea of a fool to give this gift. The talk of those who preach a doctrine of survival is vain and false. That is, doctrine of survival after death is vain and false. Fools and wise, at the breaking up of the body, are destroyed and perish, and they do not exist after death. This very clearly Ajita Kesa Kampala says. Another great forerunner of the Sarvaka view of mind was a prince called Payasi. His name is Payasi. Like Ajita, he seems to have lived around the same time as the Buddha himself. And here a report of his ideas in the Buddhist Nikaya, it tells how Payasi understood experiments to show that there is no self separable from the body. Experiments that would not pass muster with a modern day scientific ethics committee or anyone. He suggested putting a man in a large sealed vessel and then baking the vessel until the person is dead. When we then open the jar and Payasi instructs, watch carefully, maybe we can see his soul escaping, but we do not see any soul escaping. If you do not have a jar that big, then just beat the life out of the man and see if a soul departs at the moment of death. This is what he says. Or weigh someone before and after killing him to see if anything has escaped. And if you are feeling sadistic and curious in equal measure, you can peel the person layer by layer to see if a soul is exposed at the core. All of this is proposed in a dialogue with Kashyapa, supposedly a a companion of the Buddha. Of course, Kashyapa can hardly insist that the soul is detectable through these gruesome instruments. But he denies the relevance of this, arguing that the Kashyapa's argument was very, very good. That's why I'm telling you this. Kashyapa tells the Payasi that thrashing a person's body to see his soul is like thrashing a trumpet to get at the music it used to make. Like the trumpet that is not being played by a musician, the body without soul is inert. This is the reply Kashyapa gives to Payasi. The figure of Payasi also comes in Jaina literature, in fact, which again makes him an interlocutor in a dialogue about the soul, in which in this case with a man called, I think his name is Casey, I think. This Payasi, this guy puts it to Casey that an ant and elephant should have souls of the same size. Why then are the activities performed by an elephant so more impressive than those of the ant? Casey responds with a metaphor. Imagine a hall in a building with no doors or window that would let light out. A lamp is then lit in the middle of the hall. It will illuminate the entire hall, but nothing further outside. But if one then covers the lamp with a bushel, then only the much smaller space within inside of the bushel will be illuminated. In just the same way, says Casey, the soul too is reborn in such a body as it is bound by the karma of his previous existence, its animate state, be it small or big, by innumerable soul units. Therefore, you should believe that the soul and the body are different and not identical. This is the conversation goes like this, but our friend is not convinced. He says no. When you die, there's no such thing as soul. When you die, everything goes away. That's what this guy says. This guy says, the Payasi says, I see wanderers, that is the ascetics, the Buddhists and Jain monks, and Brahmins of moral and virtual disposition, fond of life. If they were to know that once they were dead, they would be better off, they would take poison, hang themselves, stamp themselves, or fall off a precipice. In short, do everything to end life here as quickly as possible. They do no such thing. They are averse to dying. This is for me evidence that there is no other world, no being reborn, no fruit, no results of deeds, well or ill done. This story demonstrates that materialism was a strong undercurrent in Indian philosophy right from the beginning. Like its rival schools of thought, it must have been a philosophy of path and purpose, but one that recommended living for the here and now rather than in search of transcendental ideals and world. Okay, both Ajita and this Payasi dismissed the pretensions of Vedic rituals as a means to satisfying desire and rejected the idea that God exists and intervene on earth. Their doubts regarding soul was thus part and parcel of a more general philosophy, one that could offer a challenge to the Vedic tradition and also to Buddhism and Jainism once the materialist portion was systematized as a proper school of thought. We didn't know that whether it was systematized as a proper school of thought. It is quite possible that a systematized materialist philosophy existed but became extinct because of the relentless onslaught of the Hindu idealist schools and Buddhist and Jaina schools. But what guidelines do these materialist philosophers offer in evaluating the consequences of our action? The reports of their their enemies or the rivals say that the materialist school, the Lokayata school, embraced unbridled crass hedonism, that is, seekers of pleasure. One of the words of Charvaka of course says that when life remains, let a man live happily, nothing is beyond death. This verse says. The Jaina author Hemachandra, a staunch enemy of Charvaka, represents their teaching with the following beautiful analogy. What he says is, abandoning pleasures in this world and striving for them in the next world is like licking the elbow, leaving what is to be licked in the hand. this what is. In the case of Charvakas, however, the hedonist interpretation may be misleading. The fragments of the Charvaka Sudra available makes no mention of pleasure, and other critics fail to confirm the Hemachandra's portrayal of Charvaka ethics. It is hard to believe that they could have missed such a golden opportunity. Had they really been hedonists, that would have been the first thing they would have quoted, they would have pointed out. Okay. So in fact, a standard complaint about Charvaka is that they have no positive teaching at all. Something you would hardly say about a school committed to forthright hedonism. More likely, Charvaka did not challenge the basic goal of, let's say, Vedic ritualism. Namely, we want concrete reward for our actions. Their criticism was perhaps simply that rituals were no way to reach these rewards. If you want fruits, harvest them here and now. Don't wait for the next world. From what we have seen so far, Charvaka philosophy consisted largely in a forthright rejection of other teachings, but without much in the way of detailed argument. This is what another complaint against the Charvaka philosophy is. That is, they don't give any valid argument, they only give an example. This too is perhaps misleading. On at least two central topics of Indian philosophy, these materialists made significant contributions. One of them is the theory of self or soul. The other is epistemology. Epistemology means that is study of theory of knowledge, study of human knowledge. The other is epistemology, in particular the reliability of inference. Let us tackle inference first. The materialists were in fact willing to admit the validity of what we might call everyday inference. Consider the following passage. Perception indeed is the means of right knowledge. Since the means of right knowledge is to be non-secondary, it is difficult to ascertain an object by means of inference. That is, he doesn't want to prove anything by inference. That is secondary knowledge, and secondary knowledge is secondary. That's what it says. There's no means of knowledge for determining the other world. One could certainly take this to mean that sensation and sensation alone is a pramana. And indeed, Charvakas are sometimes called those who accept only one pramana. Pramanaikavavadin. That is the word for Charvakas. That is, they accept only one pramana. In the compressed sequence of sutras I've just quoted, Brahaspati even gives us something like an argument for this restriction of knowledge to the realm of perception. It alone is primary, whereas inference or testimony would be secondary. If you hear a growl of a tiger, you can be sure there is a tiger around because you are immediately aware of it. inferring on this basis there is really a tiger or accepting testimony from someone else falls below the standard of certainty. Nonetheless, it might be perfectly acceptable to form beliefs in this way. Perhaps you don't particularly mind about being certain. See, when you are not very, very particular about, 100% certain, you can accept this as a inference can be accepted as a pramana. That's what they say. Okay, perhaps you can use your sense perception to double check the belief in question. In fact, this is what happens in everyday life. Okay, see, we believe that eating rice or chapati will eliminate hunger because it has been done so in it has done so in the past. So you can satisfy any doubt you might have on the score right along with satisfying hunger by eating some rice or chapati. But the problem Brihaspati's remarks suggest is whether such inferences can be drawn on such topics as the other world or the existence of a incorporeal self. Okay, this can be proved as a secondary evidence, can be accepted as valid for day-to-day objects. But for something like the other world, the secondary evidence cannot be accepted just like that. This is what Brihaspati says. There are, of course, but this is precisely the sort of inference which the Nyaya and other Vedic schools want to make. Ultimately, their epistemology in the service of arguing for the self, liberation and so on. And these are also precisely the inferences that the Charvaka school is committed to refuting. So, here we are dealing with highly esoteric and controversial claims with no possibility of checking the claims using sense perception. We will never be able to make out whether there is a heaven or not by using our mind. It is impossible. Okay. So, after all, these explanations are hypotheses that can indeed be checked against empirical evidence. So the Charvaka verses ask very clearly, it asks, who will deny the validity of inference one infers fire from smoke? It's very clear. See, this inference I will agree that for even ordinary people ascertain what is to be proven by such inferences, though they may not be pursued by the logicians. However, inferences that seek to prove a soul, a self, God, an omnipotent, omniscient thing, the other world and so on, they are not considered valid by those who know the real nature of things. This is the refrain of our materialist, the common sense philosopher. They say that every day people will do just fine by making inferences so long as their mind is not vitiated by cunning logicians. Okay. For ordinary regular inferences they have no problem. But only if the inference is taken afar, they have a problem. The Charvakas have a problem. In fact, there is a beautiful anecdote. There's a beautiful anecdote that encapsulates Charvaka's approach, to this problem. There is a parable called, the wolf's footprint. It's a beautiful parable. I want to speak about this parable. See, a lovely husband and wife. Both of them are quite intelligent. They love each other. The trouble is, the husband is a Nastika and the wife is she is an Astika. He is unable to convince her by arguments, and she says, about the pramana. She says, you have to accept this inference as a pramana. That's what she says. So this guy says there's only one thing, there's only Pratyaksha Pramana is the only one thing which can be accepted. She says no. He is not able to convince his wife. So what he does is, when no one is watching, he is a skillful, draftsman. He uses his fingers to make marks on the dust of a crossroad, mimicking the footprints of a wolf. When the marks are discovered, the local scholars agree that these marks can only be explained by a wolf that has come into the village out of the forest. So the husband triumphantly tells his wife to consider the case of these footprints of the wolf. It's such a beautiful, parable. That is a 14th century scholar named Somatelaga, who transmits, one of the complete versions of these stories, emphasizes the fact that the villagers duped by the husband include the self-side scholars who solemnly inform the rest of the people that the wolf must be nearby. That is, this guy has even managed to dupe the Brahmins who speak about all these pramanas. That's what he says. He says, these people, knaves in the garb of pious, deceive normal folk by somehow convincing them of the infallibility of certain inferences and verbal testimonies, enticing them away from the hope of enjoying pleasures to be obtained after reaching heaven, and produce blind faith in pious acts. So, the parable is an analogy meant to cast doubt on the misleading promises made by the learned men of Vedic tradition and other traditions. See, the case of something like the other world or the independent self, proof is unavailable in principle. This is what, the Sarvaka philosophy says. This is not like the wolf who may or may not have made the footprint. In that case, we can still make sense perception to track it down and verify its existence. You may doubt that the wolf might have come, but that story can still be verified. Okay. By contrast, this is very, very important. You should understand this. By contrast, another world reached only after death could be completely inaccessible to sense perception, which is the source of our knowledge. And it does make a certain amount of sense to reject belief in things that are in principle unknowable, that are simply beyond our ken or beyond our comprehension, given that there could not be possibly any evidence for them. This is what the Sarvaka philosophy says. Okay, that is, in principle, it is impossible to tell a human being that there is another world which is in existence, which is ready for you, which is ready to take you in. Okay, that's what. So Brahaspati says very clearly. He says we will examine the nature of the reals. What are the real things? He says, earth, fire, air, and water are the reals. Their combination is called the body, senses, and objects. Chaitanya, that is consciousness, is formed out of these elements. He gives an example as the power to intoxicate is formed out of fermenting ingredients. A human being, that is Purusha, is a body qualified by consciousness, body with consciousness. Okay, thinking is from the body alone. There's no outside body. There's no thing. There's no thought or nothing. Okay, because of its presence, when there's a body. When there's no body, there's no thinking. This is what Brahaspati says. Everything that exists, says Brahaspati, is identical to the element or to some combinations of them. Lest we wonder how our complex surroundings could have arisen from such simple ingredients. This is a question everyone asks now. Why is the world so complex? He says the world is varied due to variations in origin, janma, or the janma, as the eye in the peacock's tail. Okay, every peacock has varied, eyes in its tail. Because it is born that way. That's what he says. In fact, it's a real shame that the Charvaka theory of mind is not better preserved. That the works of school is lost and known only through hostile reports. Brahaspati, of course, as I said, proposed that human beings are physical bodies which can be conscious, and that consciousness is something that emerges out of the organization of physical matter and disappears again when the organization that sustains it is destroyed. His position is thus one resonates powerfully with those taken by most philosophers of mind nowadays, who likewise tend to see a close relationship between mind and body with the physical, somehow giving rise to the mind. Okay, this sums up so far, the materialist school. I should also mention to you about another school which dissented from the Brahmanical worldview. Another Nastika school. This is not I won't call it a materialist school. It's a Nastika school. The Ajivikas. They were more pessimistic and thought that the cycle of rebirth was impossible to escape, and that there's no point trying to affect one's karma. To achieve liberation, each individual just has to wait until the cycle of incarnations, comes to an end. That Ajivikas, they say ominously that will take millions and millions of years. See, the Makhali Kosala, the Ajivika thinkers, he denies sin or adharma and even denies human effort in shaping the destiny of human beings. Okay, he is supposed to have held an atomic cosmology, and that all beings in the course of time are destined to culminate in a state of final salvation. He believes not only in rebirth but also in a special doctrine of reanimation, according to which it is possible for one person's soul to be reanimated in the dead bodies of others. Thus, it's not quite correct to call the Ajivikas as materialists. They are certainly not material. I won't call them materialists. In fact, Gosara, he held that everything happens exactly as it is predestined to happen by niyati, the niyati is fate, so that human action is ineffective and inconsequential. His views are described in the recorded dialogues of Buddha as follows. He says there is no power in humans, no strength or force, no vigor or exertion. All that lives is without control, without power or strength. They experience the fixed course of pleasure and pain through the 6 kinds of rebirth. Because pleasure and pain have been measured out with a measure limited by the round of birth and death, and there is neither increase nor decrease, neither excellence nor inferiority. Just as a ball of string, when thrown, runs till it is all unraveled, so fools and wise run on and circle round till they make an end of suffering. So, the Ajivikas denied that we have any responsibility for our actions. In fact, they could be understood to deny that action is possible at all if to act involves making rational choices. How then could one live if the idea that reason can be the guide of human action is a myth? That is, for whatever way we act, we should reason out why we act the way we act. Okay, if that itself is a myth, then how should one live? Gosala, he thought that the answer lies in asceticism. One should withdraw as far as possible from the pretension of action at all, and instead live as a renunciate and forest dweller. That's what he says. This lifestyle was embraced especially by those Ajivakas who claimed their period of waiting were finally nearing an end, and that in their present lives they were experiencing the last of their many incarnations. This in short is what the Ajivaka says. I think more than is enough. I think today I come to the end of the session. Most probably my next talk will be on the Sankhya and Yoga schools of philosophy.